Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be covering game number 15 on my road to chess mastery. Now, this was a separate game just by itself. It was in the middle of the following games' tournaments. However, my opponent missed the first, I believe, two games and they wanted to play one, and I finished I believe it was the second game early, so I obliged and I played them, and let's see how the game progressed. I am playing with the black pieces versus Henry H. Alright, e4 from my opponent and e5 from me. This is something that I was playing quite a bit, so I'm just sticking with what I know because that's usually what you want to do in tournaments. It's different when you're online because online rating usually to most people doesn't matter as much, so you can experiment online and then try what you know best during tournaments. Bishop to c4, bishop to c5. So I'm just trying to transpose into the immediate knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4, bishop to c5. So I just play bishop to c5. I'm not trying to allow any tricks or anything or changes to what I normally play. I don't want to play knight to f6. I don't want to do anything that might mess me up. So bishop to c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, just defending the pawn. Now we transpose into the Giuoco Pianissimo. D3, knight to f6, and castles. Here I play h6. I just want to prevent any bishop g5s before I castle. It's always a logical thing to do. Now we see h3, I castle, and then they play knight to c3. Another very common thing for white to do is just play c3 and knight to d2 instead. But knight to c3, there's not too much wrong with it. I play d6, and now we just have a completely symmetrical structure. It's the exact same from both sides if you look at it. Pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, knight here, bishop here, and knight here, pawn here, castled on the same sides. So exactly the same position, just symmetrical. Now we see the first change. They go a3 and I go a5. So I'm trying to gain more space on this side of the board. I think a5 is perfectly fine. It just prevents any b4 moves, which is usually a good thing to do. So I thought it was reasonable. There's also always ideas of a6 and b5 for black, but after seeing a3, I decided to change pace and go a5. Now we see knight to d5. Interesting move. I took on d5. There wasn't really too much thought that went on there. Another move is just bishop e6, which is also reasonable, where after takes, bishop takes. I can choose to take with the queen or the pawn. Usually, maybe with the pawn isn't so great, just because the light squares are a little weak. However, they don't have their light square bishop anymore, so it shouldn't matter too much. But it's also just something to think about. And queen takes, of course, is alright too. And you will still go for either an f5 or a d5 in these positions. So it's just a matter of preference. But alright, knight to d5 I took, and I go for the aforementioned plan of bishop to e6. Just going for f takes e6. And this is exactly what happened in the game, where bishop takes and pawn takes. The whole point of this is, even though you have doubled pawns, and some might consider that to be a weakness, oftentimes it's very hard to prove that they are, because you just go d6 to d5, and you get a somewhat of a hanging pawn structure, but you get this really nice center because you just bring the f-pawn to the center, and in these cases it's often a good thing. So that was just my plan there. Now we see bishop to e3 and a repeat, so basically they want the same structure as I do. However, I tried to change things up and make things different. I tried to avoid trades. I went knight to d4, which is an okay move. It's not really the most perfect move, because essentially what's going to happen is this pawn on e5 is going to be on d4, no matter what, as long as they trade. So knight d4, knight takes d4, and if bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4, that pawn's still going to be on d4 no matter what. And I'll show here. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Now the pawn's there. Now there are pros and cons to this. One can say that I have more space. However, it is also harder to play d5, because d5, pawn takes, and my pawns are doubled, and in the center they're actually quite weak. as compared to before, where when we look at this type of structure, if I get in the move d5, let's just say a random move, king h1, d5, pawn takes, this is completely different because I don't have double pawns and my center is actually quite nice here. So it's a very different situation. However, bishop to e3, knight d4, knight takes d4, I took with the pawn. I thought this would be interesting because I wanted to change things up and I wanted to make things more complicated for my opponent. However, this showed to be more complicated for me, and in reality, what I should have done was take with the bishop. Even though it doesn't look so great, the point is, when you play e takes d4, I knew I was doing this in the game, and I knew this would be not a great move. I was expecting to get rid of complications. I was underestimating my opponent. I was playing a bad move that I knew was a bad move because my opponent was, I believe, 200 or 300 rating lower than me. I thought that I could get away with something like this and then just somehow keep things a little complicated and end up winning. This is a very bad way to think when you're playing chess. You should always be thinking, what is my best move? Because either they'll find a good response or they won't. When you play hope chess, which is in reality what e takes d4 is, you are allowing your opponent more options to punish your play, and you're just hoping that they don't. And that's not what you should be doing, because chess isn't a gamble. It's a series of objective analysis, essentially. So e takes d4, strategically not so great because it blocks in the bishop, and just the whole premise behind it of trying to outsmart my opponent, very bad idea. Very bad. This is something that doesn't matter what rating your opponent is, you should not be playing with that type of mindset. So let's just continue and see how the game progressed. Bishop to d2. I played e5 just to prevent f4, and they played f4 anyways, of course. So I took, rook takes, bishop takes, and queen to f6. So now it's time for me to at least get some more activity. Queen to d2 and rook to f8. So a trap I was setting up here was if rook to f1, then there's g5, and I win a piece. Because if they move away, then the rook is hanging. Of course, they did see this. They played bishop to g3, and I played bishop to b6. I just thought it's time to put it there because even though I was threatening them as well with this move, they are going to attack this pawn. So after bishop g3, now they're actually attacking the pawn and threatening to take it. So bishop b6 does protect it. You don't really want to play a move like b6 because b4 would be very sad to see. After takes, our bishop is trapped and we cannot protect it in any way. So bishop b6 and queen to e2, just preparing a possible rook to f1 if they wanted to go into an endgame. I played queen to g5 as I wanted to trade on the e3 square, and we'll actually talk about why I was looking at this. King to h2 and queen to e3. Now this looks like a really silly move. Why would I allow them to take? Because don't they just win the pawn? And what I saw in the game was not quite. The whole reason why is because, for example, c3 preparing d4. The thing is, this e-pawn will always be weak. And if we look further into the game, so let's just say a4, right? a4 is a pretty good move. It just kind of locks down their pawn structure on the side of the board. It controls both of these two pawns. d4, there's rook to e8. That was my whole idea. So after they do that, then they pretty much have to play e5 to protect it. There's no other way to protect it. And after takes, if they go bishop takes, then there's just c5. And if they go pawn takes, now it's protected. And I should be okay here. In fact, maybe even better. Because I can always go like rook e6 or even king f7 here. And if rook f1, I just go king e6. And my pieces get a lot more active. Though like this is a very difficult endgame to convert or anything. Black has more activity. And the pawn on e3 feels a lot stronger than the pawn on e5. Because my king is blockading, so yeah, I just assess this position as better for black, if anything. But going back to the game, so king h2, I went queen e3, and they went rook e1, so they didn't take. They, I believe they saw that stuff, so they just didn't want to go for those complications. Queen takes e2, rook takes e2, and rook f1, trying to, you know, probe in their position with maybe a rook to b1. However, they go rook e1, and this just prevents it all. So I took, bishop takes, and here I should have just gone a4 immediately. a4 is a very strong move because it just prevents them from attacking the pawn, and it also locks in these two pawns. And a move like b3 isn't ever really too desirable because it just kind of breaks down the structure a little bit more. So even though there might not be any targets, it's still something, and it's still something I can try to play against, even if it's not better for me at all. Anyways, so yeah, bishop takes e1, I go king f7. I'm just trying to improve my king instead, so I didn't really think of a4 here. g4, king e6, bishop h4. I thought I had to play g5 here, I just didn't want them to get any activity. Though they don't really get activity anyways, so I think g5, it's fine. It's not a terrible move. It's just we'll have to watch out for it. Maybe h4 is taking and then bishop d2, for example. That could be an issue. So here, let's just say a random move like c6, h4, and then I don't take. So bishop a4 takes, and bishop to d2, for example. And then now I'm kind of tied down to the pawn. That was just like a rough example, but play can easily continue. Like something like that, so that's something we would want to avoid. But okay, bishop to or g5 and then bishop to g3. Now we see a4 finally. Now it blocks down these two pawns, and king to g2. Now here I had a really pretty good move. I played bishop to a5, and the whole point is I just want to go here, right? Go bishop d2 and go bishop to c1. However, my opponent played b4, and this is where I blundered. So this is a blunder. b4 is a blunder, and I want you guys to try to find out why. If you can pause the video or anything, it's not really too crazy because there's only one move you can really look at, and that is the move bishop takes b4. I don't know why I didn't see this in the game. When going back to analyze this game earlier today for this video, I'm very shocked that I didn't see this, because even at this point of my chess learning, I was studying endgames. But after bishop takes b4, this is just winning because we win the a3 pawn as well. And the whole point is, if you take, we get to promote. It's a little tricky though. You have to watch out for bishop to f2, as bishop to e1 doesn't work because it's there's no c3, there's no bishop c3, so just a2. Bishop c3 is covered by the d4 pawn. But the important move here that we have to look at, bishop f2, oh sorry, a3, and bishop f2. Though luckily we have the move c5. And after c5, unfortunately, they're just losing, as c3 is too slow because a2. We just ignore this. We don't take or anything. And after takes, we promote. So this is just winning for black, and unfortunately I missed this in the game, and I took en passant instead. Okay, so as I was saying, here after c takes b3, bishop to c3, and king to f3, this is all still a draw, but I did mess this up. And how did I mess this up? I played a pretty bad move here, and I think this was just the losing move, though my following moves didn't really help my cause. I played d5. I was thinking that I can trade, but the second I played it, I immediately recoiled in disgust because c7 was hanging here. I'm not threatening to win a pawn with this move, so they can just take c7, and this is exactly what my opponent did. They took first, king takes, and bishop takes c7. After bishop to b2, just a4, and unfortunately this is just a losing endgame now. King e4, bishop to c3, bishop e5, now threatening to take, and I'm just too slow. And it might look like I have a chance here, but I'm just too slow. I resigned in this position, as after d5, b4, d6, b3, d7, b2, queen and queen, they can give a check, check, and take my queen. And this is completely winning. where king f6, king to f7, king to g6, king to d3 takes, and takes. And they're 2 pawns up. I don't even have opposition, but in these situations, being 2 pawns up, it doesn't matter if you have opposition or not, because it's just 2 pawns. And whenever you see them, especially protecting each other, it's there's nothing you can do. So, unfortunately, this was a loss after b5 here. I played b5 and then resigned. And it was unfortunate because I was high rated and I pretty much gambled. I played suspicious moves to try to play for the win, which I shouldn't have played. If you're trying to complicate things for your opponent, make sure they're complications that you know you wouldn't be worse in. That is my only advice. So don't make things worse for yourself because you think you're a better opponent or you're better than your opponent, because that's a very toxic way to think as well. I just wish I didn't do that here. And I wish that I also saw bishop takes b4, but that's not really the lesson of this. The lesson for this is not to underestimate your opponents. Doesn't matter what the ratings are, you're playing yourself. Every position is a new position, and you have to play the position, not the person. That's all I gotta say, guys. And I hope you enjoyed this. This was definitely a very fundamental and important lesson. As compared to most of my other ones for the Road to Chess Mastery. I think this is the most important one so far. And I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one, guys.